and welcome to Games as Lit 101. Call of Duty is an interesting series.
By which I mean it's actually kind of a boring and repetitive series in most respects, but the effect it has on its fans is very fascinating. I'm not talking about the stereotypical 13-year-old screaming profanities into a mic. I'm talking about why people enjoy Call of Duty. Because I've rarely heard a Call of Duty fan praise the story, the level design, or even really the basic mechanical design, beyond multiplayer balancing issues, and let's face it, most of that is just whining about whatever weapon or tactic kills you most often.
No, there's something different about Call of Duty, something that we don't necessarily think about when we're generally thinking about judging the games we play. Its appeal doesn't lie entirely in its game mechanics. I mean, let's face it, at its core, those game mechanics are just a fancy shooting gallery, and it's certainly not in the storytelling, at least not since the original Modern Warfare, and maybe its sequel. No, there's something else that gets people interested in this series. So, let's take a look at some concepts and see what we can dig up. First, we have to talk about something called the aesthetics of play. This concept was originally introduced in an academic paper by Robin Hunicke, Marc LeBlanc, and Robert Zubek in the early 2000s. This paper is absolutely foundational to the study and practice of game design, so if you haven't read it yet, I highly suggest that you do. The link is in the description. We don't have time to cover even all of the basics of this paper in this episode, so for now we're just going to focus on the aesthetics of play. In short, aesthetics of play are the underlying reasons why we play a game. They're the overall experience that a game grants us. We tend to think of video games in very basically descriptive terms. Things like racing, first-person or third-person perspective, shooting, fighting, all of these things, but those are honestly such basic descriptors that they don't say much about the game, really. I mean, Mario Kart and Forza are both racing games, but it would be extremely foolish to actually argue that they provide the same experience. Similarly, Fallout 3, Call of Duty, and even Portal are all first-person, and they all feature a lot of shooting, but there are so many differences in how they work, from the mechanics to the dynamics to the story to the visuals, so many different things that make them all very different experiences from one another. These overall experiences are the aesthetics of play, and they range from a lot of reasons that you play a game, like the thrill of discovery, or expression, or narrative. There are 8 in total in the original paper. I'd love to talk about them in detail, but that's enough for a whole episode, which is probably something that I'll do at some point, but for now, if you want to know more about the topic as a whole, I recommend not only reading the original paper, but also checking out the episode that Extra Credits did on the subject. They are awesome, and they probably explain it better than I could anyway, so that link is in the description as well. Now, one of these aesthetics is fantasy. Now remember, we're not talking about a descriptor of the content of a game. We're talking about the underlying reasons why you play it, the feeling that you get from the experience. So we're not talking about magic and elves when we say fantasy in this context. We're talking about a game where you step into a desirable role. This is about experiencing the adrenaline rush of battle, or the power of the chosen one, destined to save the world, or yes, or becoming a Hollywood star and rising to fame and popularity. The point is, this is about stepping into a role that you can aspire to and look up to. It's basically playing make-believe.
At this point, it's probably obvious where Call of Duty fits in. Fantasy is far and away its strongest aesthetic of play. It presents a glamorous, fantastical vision of war, reminiscent of America's glorification of war during the 2 world wars. It's not a realistic vision of the living hell that is war, because war is awful. Instead, it presents more like an action movie, giving the player sets of awesome battles and epic set pieces that make them feel like an awesome, powerful soldier. It fulfills a very common power fantasy for American audiences, that of nobly protecting their country from those who would threaten it.
In gameplay, this manifests in the structure and design of the game, and where the developers focused their attention during its creation. There's a big emphasis in the series on using a variety of realistically rendered military hardware. All the guns in the game are actual weapons from real life, complete with their actual names, with a whole bunch of letters and numbers and acronyms that I can honestly never quite remember and tell the difference between. Even now that the series is jumping decades into the future with Advanced Warfare, the developers are consulting military futurists in hopes of grounding all the science fiction elements of their game in reality and in what we currently understand. All of this is essentially an attempt to minimize the suspension of disbelief necessary for the player to jump into the shoes of this soldier and live out this fantasy. It goes without saying that in any work of art, certain elements are going to take priority over others, and that's perfectly fine, but what's interesting here is the way that a lot of these games that focus on fulfilling player fantasies tend to forsake a lot of other basic elements, like storytelling and even game design, in favor of it.
One of the strongest recent examples is Rise, Son of Rome. Most of its gameplay is basically a visually resplendent version of Simon, requiring you to hit people with a few attacks before triggering QuickTime events that only utilize 2 of the controller's buttons. It's spectacularly boring on its own. But the game uses the setting, visuals, and impossibly cool-looking executions to give the player a feeling of power and strength as a Roman soldier. The best example is the use of the tortoise formation, a battle formation commonly used by Roman armies wherein everyone stacks their shields around them to protect themselves while they move forward. It's a neat touch, being a historically accurate military tactic, and helps cement the feeling of immersion in the role of a Roman soldier. But if you actually think about it while you're playing, you realize all you're doing is holding the control stick forward until an arrow volley comes along, at which point you hold a button until it's done and repeat the process until you're through. This is mind-numbingly boring game design here.
Now, this isn't necessarily a bad thing, but when we look at some games in this context, it does tend to explain a lot. If not handled properly, it can really get in the way of a lot of the other elements of a game.
Call of Duty Ghosts is one of the best examples I've seen. Even in the promotions, the writers talked about how you were underpowered, undermanned, and undertrained compared to your enemies. Then some other guys came in to talk about how awesome, well-equipped, and well-trained you were. The result was reflected in the game, a story that communicated a desperate situation coupled with gameplay that rarely actually had you at a disadvantage. This ludonarrative dissonance was the result of the game trying so hard to be a player fantasy that it actually clashed with its own story.
There are a lot of reasons to make and enjoy games, and the idea of making a game centered around fulfilling the player's fantasies is not a bad idea in the slightest. And most games, while they do have some element of most of the aesthetics of play, will only focus on 1 or 2 in particular, and that's perfectly fine. But it is also important to maintain some level of balance, to not focus so tightly on 1 or 2 of the aesthetics of play that you completely ignore or even wreck all of the others.
By prioritizing fantasy so far over narrative, Ghosts maintained an incredibly distracting dissonance between the gameplay and story. By making the gameplay solely in service to the fantasy of being a Roman soldier, Rise featured really boring gameplay and a story full of plot holes and weak writing.
So what do you think? Do you think that overemphasis on the fulfillment of player fantasy can get in the way of other elements of a game, or are you alright giving up some aspects of a game for the sake of feeling awesome as you play? Whatever your thoughts, let's get some class discussion going in the comments. Hey YouTube students. I had actually filmed the last shot of this lesson before, but unfortunately I had to switch things around a little bit. The next episode is supposed to be a literary analysis of Beyond Good and Evil, but considering we have 2 new Assassin's Creed games coming out in a bit, I figured it would be more timely to take care of a topic regarding that series. So instead, next week we're going to be talking about the Animus, and how that's used as a framing device in Assassin's Creed not only for the story, but also for the gameplay, the characters' interaction, and the limitations that the game needs to force on them. So we will be talking about Beyond Good and Evil still, don't worry, but that's going to be 1 week later. So just letting you know about the schedule change, and I'm looking forward to that. So until then, class dismissed.